Welcome everyone to the second artist talk in the Immersive Sonic Journeys project. My name's Harvey. I'd like to welcome you all to our artist talk today with Jane Sheldon, who will be talking about her work for the project in just a moment. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and note that this is unceded lands, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Just very briefly about the project, this has been a collaboration between Soul Sound Studios and at RMIT University, the Design and Sonic Processing Research Group, and Melbourne Recital Centre. And it's been to explore different ways that the centre could use their foyers and stairwells for attracting audiences in at times when maybe there's not a concert on, or around concerts as well. And to do this, we've commissioned 4 artists and also repurposed some previous work that we had commissioned to play in spatial sound systems around the centre. It started off with a workshop in February of this year when we had 3 of the 4 artists in the studio, and then we spent half a day on site investigating how sound might work and how they might respond to the actual spaces as well. So Jane, welcome.
Hi.
I thought I've got a couple of questions for you, but I'm more than happy to veer off script into other things as we might need to or want to as we go through. But I thought, first of all, I might just ask you as a general question. You, of course, have a background as a performer, as a singer, and I'm just curious about your work and creative projects around installation and composition, for that matter, as well.
So I have, for much longer than I've been composing, I've been performing primarily chamber opera, and primarily chamber opera by living composers. A lot of my composing is informed by that experience, and I sort of initially came to composing, writing kind of chamber music for voice, sort of quite naturally out of that performer background. And then in February 2020, I enrolled in a doctorate in composition. And a month later, I thought, oh, I'm going to have to somehow produce quite a large portfolio of works without being able to be with other musicians for the foreseeable future. And that was a real puzzle, because I didn't want to make things that I just thought it would be so weird and perverse to create a portfolio that was not realizable, actually, that was just this completely imaginary, abstract thing. So I quickly panic emailed Ben Carey, who was on the department at the Sydney Con, and said, can I audit all your electronic music courses, because I'm going to have to work out how to make music that doesn't require bodies in space, at least for part of this portfolio. And cut to a year later, and I had sort of cobbled together some skill and understanding of working in a DAW and all of that stuff. Cut to a year later, in 2021, I ran into the visual artist Agatha Goethe-Snape, who was an embedded artist in a curatorial team at the Powerhouse in Sydney. Huge museum, part of the broader organisation, the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences. And Agatha said, so I don't know how she intuited this, because I had made no installation works at all. And she said, I'm just wondering if you would be the sound designer and make a bespoke sound installation on this enormous exhibition about eucalyptus. And I have no idea why she thought of me. It was just a strange impulse she had. And I said, well, tell me a bit more about the exhibition. And she did, and it sounded very beautiful. And I said, yeah, I'll do it. And then she said, can you do it in less than 2 months? And I was like, sure. I was just sort of, okay. And so then I went in for a meeting, and I said to them, I have lots of really beautiful ideas for this, but I've never done this before, and I will need a ton of technical support, because I don't know how to do this. And they fortunately were equipped to give me that support, and I made this work very intuitively with quite a limited set of skills really, and it really worked beautifully in tandem with the other elements of the design in a way that I have quite spooky feelings about, because I didn't feel I came into the project with enough knowledge to feel responsible for the fact that it worked so well. Somehow though, it did. And I found the process really beautiful, and I just thought, I want to do this. It's not that I thought I want to do this all the time, because I love being a performer and I do continue to do that, but I just thought I want to do this as much as I can. Yeah. So, yeah.
So then, it was a little while after when we put the call out. It was 2023. We put the call out for this particular project. How did you then approach the brief for this one, where we were talking about a specific building, but we didn't necessarily, the thematics of it were quite open. We didn't, from memory, we didn't put any boundaries around the type of work or the themes of that, only that there was an opportunity, there'd be some workshops, and then you would compose a work for a building. So how did you start this particular one?
Yeah, well this call out, it was appealing in so many ways. Firstly, because it was going to be so site specific, and also because it was in the context of a university program. I knew I wouldn't be alone. Like, I knew if I needed kind of to skill up in some particular way to realise the work, that people would be available to help me out. So when we came to first do the site visit, the weirdest thing was, I've performed in this building, I've sung in the main auditorium and in the salon, and so I felt like I knew the building really well. And then when we did the walkthrough of the public spaces, I realised I'd never been in a lot of them. I didn't know about that blue stairwell, which is so gorgeous. And I thought, wow, these spaces are so much more than merely functional passages. And so there was much more to respond to than I even realised with the initial invitation. I would say I'm as interested as I am in the behaviours of sound. I'm equally interested in the behaviours of people. And so, that first work I made for Powerhouse has some things in common with the work I've made here, because in both cases, I've tried to put sounds in places that they make use of the spatialisation in a particular way, where there are sounds that are far enough away from where a person might be that you think, oh, did I hear that? I'm going to have to get closer to really be present with the sound. And I love doing that. There's kind of like, there's a version of this work where there are like motion sensors that draw people to, but I say that, and then when we were installing it, I thought, we don't actually need any of that. It's amazing that the space itself kind of makes it the case that the person moving through it has to sculpt the experience because they're travelling across given distances. The way I wanted to respond to these spaces was to make use of the vertical, the height, in both the front stairwell and the blue stairwell. And about 7 years ago, I read this article about this woman, an American woman called Hannah Up, the article's in the New Yorker, written by Rachel Aviv. It's an amazing article. And this woman, she experiences dissociative fugues. So she temporarily, completely and involuntarily, completely abandons her identity and is quite functional, but is not aware of who she is. And in this woman's particular case, when she emerges from this fugue state, for her, she's in a body of water. And I read this and I thought, I have to make a work out of this. And I kept thinking I had an outlet for it, and it never was right. And then when I was in here, I was like, this is the place. Because I wanted to use water, and you can have water fall. And initially I thought, oh, well, I'm going to need some kind of really complicated vertical speaker array where I'm placing very finely all these drops. And again, I don't really need it. Like the space, I just realised when we were installing, if I just put enough of these water sounds up high, there's actually nothing acoustically really that I could say, that I could define that's happening that is those sounds falling. But because they call you up to them, as you get closer, there's some experience of the water falling. It's just mysterious. So I put a lot of water in the work, and I also, in the work, I sing this poem by Apollinaire that's from 1908 in French. And in this, it starts, it's raining women's voices as if they had died even in memory. And so it's just the most gorgeous poem to contain all these elements of falling water, this woman who doesn't remember who she is, and the sound of a feminine voice.
It's interesting because we didn't, we did spend a lot of time trying to be very careful about where individual speakers were placed. We didn't want to overdo the sound system in here, which meant in addition to the workshops that we had when you were down, we would come back and do site visits to work out points where we felt what I've now called the vistas, where there's a natural stopping point, which it's not unusual in architecture or a circulation system. There's a, say, platform and a stairwell, and you turn around and the window's at the right height, and it happens to just be above the gardens in back of the NGV or something like that. So you do get drawn to certain points and moments, but of course they're not articulated by sound. They're predominantly visual and light in that way. So, but I also had the same experience with the blue stairwell that you just mentioned as well. Like we first worked here back in 2009 when it opened, and I've been to many concerts since, and I had never seen the blue stairwell before that. And so when you come around the corner and up, you suddenly, it's like you've gone through the wardrobe into the other world. It's this strange, very high resonant space, 3 steps from Sturt Street.
Yeah.
If that, as you come around the corner. So and again, very resonant chamber, and you just feel like you've stepped into another world. So that, it's been interesting to hear the other artists as well talk about the experience of going into there, because it's not a usual listening environment. Oh, that's right, because then the other thing with that particular space is that, again, because of platforms and the levels that it has to ascend over such a short horizontal distance, there's actually 6 or 7 different listening points in the vertical that you could go through from ground to the top level. So again, you can ascend through a stairwell in that way. So that's why I thought your response to the space was really fascinating, because you immediately, or not immediately, but you did lock into that sense of how height could play a role, both actually or spatially, but also conceptually. And as you say, that sense of falling, the combination of the voices falling and the water falling. So you do get, I find with your work especially, that sense of your attention being drawn up, but then something coming down at the same time. You get those 2 motions. And so, flowing on from that, going on from that, and I suppose you have answered this a little bit here, but the usual relationship between a performer and listener is one where the listener is static, sitting in a concert hall, and even if the performer only moves from the wings to the middle of the stage, they are in motion, let alone in some kind of theatrical space where they're constantly moving around the stage. In this environment, that's reversed. The sound sources themselves are predominantly static, unless there's some kind of panning and spatialisation. And we've got a listener moving. So how did that sort of play around your imagination or thinking when you've got this mobile listener?
I love a mobile listener, but it's interesting because when I'm performing on stage, I really like the fourth wall. I don't want it to feel like a social space that we're in together. I want it to feel like something is happening there that is compelling, and so I'm going to stay in my seat until it's done. But so this is very different, and I can't imagine actually making a sound installation for static audience in this way. Like, I noticed, for example, that my levels in general, when I was installing, I was choosing levels that were quite a bit lower than a lot of the other works.
You mean sound levels for
Yes,
the
sorry.
loudness of the work? Yeah, sure.
Right, yeah, the sound levels. And for a second, you know, I was like, is this a mistake? Everyone's being louder than me. And then I realised, oh no, this is just because I like making work that contains sounds where you think, oh, did I catch it? And then you have to go to it. So I think, like my work contains whispers. I've made work in the past that contains hyperdirectional speakers where you're only going to get the sound if you walk into the field of projection. I like the idea that in this work, and so far in everything I've made actually, I like the idea that if a listener stays in one place throughout the entire thing, they have a very specific experience that happens to mean they won't hear the whole thing. Like, to actually catch all the sound, you have to move towards things in a way. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting when I reflect on that first work I made that did contain motion sensors. We were thwarted from opening because of a COVID lockdown. So we were going to open on the day that we went into lockdown for the second time. So the work, we didn't open for 4 more months in the end. And I found out later that they'd left my sound on. And I was very moved by this actually. But in particular, what I found moving was I'd built that work so that there were these layers of sound that were going, and then there were what I kept calling the garden of sonic blossoms, which would only bloom when triggered by somebody walking past a motion sensor. So all the blossoms, they never bloomed in this time that the exhibition was running, this sound was running. But in the absence of people, it couldn't come into full expression. And not just in the absence of people, but in the absence of moving people. So something about the insane poetry of that weird accident really amplified the degree to which I value people moving through the work. And obviously, if you have motion sensors triggering sound, that's a very what would be the word? Like, you can point to the fact that their motion is activating the work, but they're activating their motion through any sound installation sculpts the experience in great detail. And likewise with this one. And I realise for now how important it is to me that they're moving and that very personal sculpture is happening.
I remember talking to a colleague who was actually composer and cybernetician back in the 2000s, when interactive works, that period through the 90s and 2000s where interactive works were right at the forefront and they're very incredibly popular amongst artists. And you remember Ranulph pointing out that a conversation is the most interactive thing you can have. And that one, and also seeing a work, I think it was at Museum of Modern Art, New York, it was effectively a very strong light and a shadow. It was one of the most, that you could play with shadows, one of the most popular works apparently in the exhibition. Very simple, highly responsive, lots of room for imagination. And so there is, I'm always a bit conflicted around interactivity.
Yeah.
How much do you actually need? Particularly when you consider, for the most part, audiences will only hear the work once.
Yeah.
So there has to either be some other conversational dialogue you can have with the work because of the interactivity.
Yeah.
Or you might as well just pre-render and think about the layers and, as you say, the opportunities of the moving audience to do that they will trigger and hear different things based on other perspectives in that way. And of course, in some ways it simplifies the logistics of delivery and reduces the number of moving parts and things to go wrong. But then I can see why it's interesting for musicians, because it's the relationship we have either with an instrument or with our own voice. There's a sense that we have agency, for example, to do that. So I'm wondering then around that idea of agency, without interactivity, does the audience you think, and a listener going through the space still has a kind of agency within the work, even though nothing they do is going to change it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think once they're moving, there's a particular kind of agency in full bloom, like that one's distance from any given object is deterministic of what the work is for that person. Also, the subtlety of, so whenever I make anything that's interactive, I don't tell anyone. So, and I try to make it so that with motion sensor stuff, I always build in random amounts of silence, so that if you think you've worked it out, then there will be a long period of several minutes where you're trying to trip the trigger and nothing's happening. So it's important to me that it's mysterious how the work is put together, and it is very different having elements triggered by motion in that interactive way, because in a case like that, I don't even know how things will play out, and I like that. But it's also true that no two people, once a work is as spatialized as what we've done in this building, no two people can possibly have the same experience, and that's valuable to me. So there is there's actually a lot of agency on the part of the listener, but they might not realise, and that's fine.
I think so. Well, we've also had the privilege of being in the building with the works over an extended period of time, which means, I know certainly in my case, I've heard the same piece from different locations at different times of the day, given the repeats.
Yeah.
And you do hear different things. I know a few times I thought, oh, have we mucked up this file? Oh no, that's right. It must be that. It's where you're standing here and you're hearing the layer differently to what you've heard it elsewhere. But one of the, just coming back to your work for this project, of course, voices, water and memory permeate the whole piece. And I found one of the experiences I did have this strange disassociation when I was gazing out at a sunny Melbourne spring day through the large windows, which is possibly not unusual given the motivation for the work, or that initial impetus as well. And of course, you're looking at a cityscape whilst being immersed in water and song. And I'd say that I didn't necessarily feel a split, but I felt like this expansion between the two things. Did that play again into your ideas of what might be experienced by a listener?
That's nice to hear. I try to create this kind of work from as few elements as possible, and so you're often spending quite a long time with a type of sound. So this is full of water, so all these different kinds of water. And what I love about water sound is that, okay, so you're listening to a creek, and on one measure, it's the same sound for a long period of time, but there's so much detail in the sound that moment to moment it's actually never the same. And what's attractive to me about sound that behaves like that, and about using as few elements that are like that as possible, is that I do think there's some capacity to sort of distort time, like suspend time a little bit, because your attention is it just gets finer and finer, because you do, if you spend the time, you do awaken to the fact that there's just a seemingly endless amount of things to notice about this texture. And relatedly, so I use almost no synthetic sound. And one of the reasons behind that, I suppose, is about wanting to activate memory, and I just have a sort of belief that natural sound is good at that. So I think maybe the state you were in, hopefully, I'd be thrilled if the state you're in is kind of one of like suspension in memory, even if it's not like a kind of identifiable memory, but just to pull you out of the pace of whatever you're looking at out the window. That it's gratifying to me if the work does that to somebody.
And I think that also speaks to that transformative quality of sound and the nature of listening, is that it can very quickly just bounce you across into that other world, can't it? It's not like, we always spend all this time about virtual reality, and we've got the latest somewhat, I won't denigrate a commercial product in case I get sued, but let's say rather large things you have to wear in your head in order to experience virtual reality.
Yeah.
So that, you do have that enormous technology to do that, and yet sound can do that so quickly as well. When you think that way, we can just suddenly be somewhere else within that one. So, I mean, I certainly had that sense of stepping into another world where that happened, and as I say, one permeated by the sound of the voice and particularly of the water as well. It was quite strong.
Thank you.
I did have a question just around that one. If you've now have enough distance from your PhD that you feel you can maybe answer at least one question about that one. We all know what that journey can be like.
I won't have a psychotic break.
Oh, good.
It's gonna be okay.
Well, congratulations on getting it as well, because that happened sort of during the project.
I'm allowed.
But I'm just wondering, so you did undertake your PhD at Sydney University. I'm just wondering, how has that process now of research and intensely focusing into a somewhat narrow band of ideas and sound and music, how do you think that has and might influence your creative practice now?
Well, yeah, it's funny because a crisis that I had when doing the doctorate was, and I said this to my supervisor, who was very generous and understanding about it all, I just said, the problem here is I don't want to explain to people how I make my works, and I don't even want to know how I make them. So what are we going to do about that? This is really not good. And eventually she encouraged me to get over that somewhat, at least for the purposes of the dissertation. I mean, I find I'm now quicker to identify the toolkit that I have, the idiosyncratic toolkit that we each build. I'm much quicker to identify these tools, and so when I make work, I don't suffer under the illusion anymore that I have to invent every single tool from scratch for this thing. So that there's a sort of efficiency there. Even while that toolkit necessarily expands, I recognise patterns in the way I make things, and I find it helpful to know those patterns are there. The work I did for that was, it was called, the doctorate was called Composing in and Out of the Sonic Body. And so it was about what happens when sound meets bodies. Whether the sound is coming out of the body or whether the body is encountering external sound. And I finished it thinking, okay, well, thank God, I found a way to explain how I compose, and now it's done. But recently, I thought, actually, I do have an ongoing interest in researching in whatever way sound's effects on physiology, and not so much so I say physiology because it's not really, I feel it's not for me to, beyond that conversation we just had about inviting people to enter into states of memory, I feel beyond that interest, it's not for me to kind of pry into the emotional response people have to music. I'm not so interested in that. I'm interested in the physical body and its all the ways, the grand mystery of like what is happening with this incredibly powerful immaterial thing meets our flesh. And the thing that's kind of wonderful about that very broad question is there's like an endless list of avenues for investigation, including like cymatics and the fact that we're full of water. Like there's just so many. I'm kind of having like put some distance between the process of academic research and now. I'm really glad to think, oh yeah, I remain very interested in that stuff that I was talking about, and there are all these really fun ways to continue to explore that stuff.
Yeah, good. Well, we're just about out of time. We need to go and start the afternoon session. So just to join me in thanking Jane for the talk today. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you very much.
That was fun.